Dear reader, allow me to introduce you to my book. Though it might at first appear like many books you've come across, it is far from ordinary. You may, therefore, have some misunderstandings about its nature. The story that awaits you has not been fully told. In fact, its conclusion is not yet known. It is in that way that without you. Chapter 1. Normal isn't what it used to be. This is a story. Nestled in a shallow valley is the town, far from the town square, across the river, past the neglected well. His name is Luka Van Horn, and like you, dear reader, was Luka's closest friend. He possessed many fine qualities, but subtlety was not. Rollo finally noticed the tears welling in his friend's eyes and the flowers on the ground. Wonderful! I had a good feeling about you. That charm is a very special thing. Keep hold of it for now. Its purpose will reveal itself soon. Rollo looked to the side suspiciously. Dear reader, forgive me for this interlude. Remember that charm you found in the dandelion? There are more of those special charms to discover throughout. They've been known to reveal themselves. Some of them can be found. Gran had commandeered the upstairs closet when she moved. Some things need shelter from a young boy's mischief. Luka tossed on his favorite old sweater. Even though it was the first day of summer, a chill still hung in the air. A pair of dull scissors, a broken can opener. An array of prepared meals crowded the refrigerator, each labeled with the day of the week. Oh my, this is quite exciting. I am now certain that you are the one I've been waiting for all these years. You'll recall I was a bit coy regarding... Excuse me, I tend to have a flair for the... You are about to encounter your first turning point. There are certain times in this tale when everything hinges on a single word. Step forth, dear reader. The less grand new, the better. We were just gonna go chill for the day. The best lies are built on truth. Easy. Impressive. You've managed to navigate your first turning point without too much of a mess. That is the power of charms. A single word can change everything. I think it's time to introduce you to the... The Chronicle is a record of the decisions you've made. You can see the turning point which has been revealed. At any time, you can use the Chronicle to go back and invoke different charms, creating new branches. Luckily for us, this is the one and only turning point where the charms won't dramatically alter fate. It's the perfect opportunity to experiment with rewriting things. Just gonna go ponder for the day. This was Luka's chance to sell his ally. Nailed it. Chapter 2. Welcome to Beacon Pine. For many years, this valley had been a small mining outpost. It wasn't until Sharper Valentine built his fertilizer company that Beacon Pines was established. Over the next 30 years, the town had grown and until the foul harvest and his sudden death. In the 6 years since, everyone was simply trying to get by. Luka looked up at the satellite dish. Rollo nearly killed himself putting that up into the tree. While it didn't turn the radio into an interstellar communicator, as he'd hoped, it did at least boost the signal enough to overhear Oh, right. Rendezvous with... This is an important turning. The first time where your charms will change the course of fate. And currently, we only have one suitable charm at our disposal. Have no fear, we can always return later using the Chronicle once we find more charms. Well, now I'm just rambling. Where were we? Rollo froze as Roxy took a step toward him, cracking her knuckles. Luka knew he had one chance to save his friend from being dragged home. In the past, he found the best way to deal with an enraged Roxy was to be a little chill. Holden Wilder ran the local paper of record, the Beacon Beacon. A bit much, if you ask me. A promise Gran regretted the second it was made. The path led into a small hollow at the end. The fence thrummed with a gentle electric buzz. Luka often asked himself what Rollo would, so that he could rule out that option. As sparks flew from the fence, the light atop that section shut off. 2 bulbs remained. One more to go. The fence's buzzing gave way to silence. Every kid in town knew the long abandoned. The warehouse once served as the industrial heart of Beacon. Now, it stood only as a reminder of things left behind. The dormant building showed strange signs of life. There was only one way to find out. thought he heard faint sounds coming from the other side of the door. He pressed his ear against the cold metal to hear better. The sound of footsteps grew louder. The heavy steel door knocked Luka to the ground. Disoriented, he looked up to see an imposing figure silhouetted in a green glow. It lunged toward him. He tried to scramble away, but felt a gloved hand latch onto his ankle. Luka watched his fingernails leave trails in the dirt as the hand slowly dragged him back through the door, into the lab, into the green light. This is a story about change. It was far from the sort of change Luka imagined for himself, but change is, after all, a dangerous animal. The end? I probably should have warned you about this. There are many paths that our story can take. Most will end in tragedy, but don't let that discourage you. We will find the ending that the story deserves. From here on out, a charm will have a checkmark when it's been used to its full potential at a given turning point. Now, let's try something different. In the past, he found the best way to deal with an enraged Roxy was to be a little shit. As the glowing windows of the old warehouse came into view, Rollo began to bounce excitedly. The boy sat petrified under the weight of the bag. Rollo felt around at the large sack which burdened them. He snapped off a tag from just within a small zipper opening in the bag. Rollo held the badge up to a faint shaft of light within the dumpster. Luka sat in the dark, tracking the sound of Rollo's footsteps as he ran. 1, 2, 3. He pressed his ear to the dumpster wall, straining to hear Rollo's footsteps as they faded away. 15, 16, 17. He tried not to think about the contents of the dumpster as he counted. 35, 36, 37. The thick stench made it hard to breathe. Screw it, that's long enough. Luka carefully lifted the lid and peered out. Nothing. No sign of Rollo. No sign of the man in the yellow suit. Time to haul ass. Luka clambered from the dumpster, stumbling to his knees. He was up like a shot and running, sprinting toward home as fast as he could. Beacon Pines flew by, blurred by the tears that welled up in his eyes. He wouldn't remember getting home at all that night. Throwing his front door open, storming up the stairs to his room and surrendering to sleep almost as abruptly as he hit his pillow. Chapter 3. Finding a friend. The next morning, it was quieter than usual at the breakfast table. Only the sound of silverware and chewing interrupted the awkward silence. Gran's brow. She let out a long sigh. Her voice was An eerie electronic sound echoed from Luka's bedroom. A pit formed in Luka. Luka's mouth felt dry. Luka could feel his heart beat. Kato volunteered at the library during the summers. He wasn't very social, so he'd dedicate each summer to becoming an expert in making him a reliable source of very particular knowledge. If you were to ask Kato something he didn't know, he'd escape into the dusty old bookshelves and return with just the right. Kato was lost in his reading. Luka crooked his neck to see the title, Introduction to... He gestured to the shelves. The entire top level of the library was devoted to comics, most of which were Hankatom. Mycological phosphorescent. The bottom corner shelf was a dusty array of thick science books. Only one binding was clean enough to read: Cellular Biology and the Chemistry of Mitosis. There were rarely any actual new additions, simply a variety of existing content rotated into the front display each week. Oh, the cobs I've eaten. a salad-centric travel guide for the mildly adventurous. Sally Seashore's simple, succulent sundries. Luka brushed off a smudge of dust. Or maybe 30 recipes so easy you'll doubt it's even edible. A peek behind the curtain. The methods and ruminations of Patrick C. Montesquieu. One of the greatest acting minds of our time, by Patrick C. Beck's family moved often, giving her little time to establish any real connection. She would tell you she prefers it that way. Luka shifted his feet uncomfortably. Beck pulled a coin from her pocket. Luka felt a chill as he approached. Her eyes were locked on the strange green liquid. The nearby grass was coated in a fine layer of frost. Luka watched as Beck dipped a broken tree branch into the good. Beck's eyes widened as flowers grew from the dead wood. First small buds, which quickly bloomed into vibrant petals. As quickly as they had grown, the flowers began to shrivel. Beck dropped the stick with a grunt of disgust. Iggy took a step towards Luka, his sneer lit by the glowing puddle. Beck could see tears welling in Luka's eyes, his fists clenched. Some things about Beacon Pines were very different from the city, but a bully from a hayseed town is really no different from a city bully. Beck took a deep breath and thought. Well, time to bust out the strange. Beck stared in silence, the only sign of life being the twitch of an eye. At the sight of Iggy taunting back, something in Luka snapped. Iggy's smirk shifted to a look of shock as Luka launched himself into his... Iggy's clothes were drenched in the glowing ooze. Iggy's voice began to slur as he struck. The person at the warehouse, this strange ooze and what it did to Iggy. Was Rollo caught up in all of this? Beck glanced toward Luka. Rollo was safe. A wave of relief washed over Luka, which was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. Gran is going to kill me. If he hurried, he might just make it home before sundown. Chapter 4. Our harvest awaits. Luka took a deep breath and gingerly opened the door, steeling himself for Gran's wrath. A beginner's guide to gardening laid open on the bench. The house was empty. Luka was sitting by the pond, listening to small waves lap against. His father sat in a folding chair in front without turning. He spoke. "Why don't you grab me some nice bait?" "Sure thing, Dad." Luka hopped over to the tackle box and popped open the lid. Inside was a rolling, buzzing. "We're fishing with bees?" Luka's father gave a warm chuckle. "Well, you catch more fish with bees than honey." Luka closed his eyes and plucked out a bee. He could feel its wings struggle between his finger and thumb. Holding it at arm's length, he hurried over. His father deftly baited the hook and examined. "Interesting choice." With a practiced flick of the wrist, the line buzzed in a graceful arc. The water accepted it without a splash or rip. The wrong choice. But the pond began to freeze over. Sometimes we gotta make the wrong choice before we can make it right. Pallid ice propagated across the still surface with an alarming... Luka scrambled back as the ground beneath him turned. "Dad, I don't understand." "Sorry, kiddo. Understanding isn't always part of the deal." The relentless ice shot through the fishing line toward his father. "Dad, look out!" His father casually wound the reel. "None of it's your fault, you know. Never was." "Dad, we have to go." Luka grabbed his father's shoulders, trying to pull him away. Please, you have to run. The ice crackled as it spread across his father's hands. That's the thing about fishing, Luka. His chest began to crystallize. You toss your hook in, and you never know what you're gonna pull out. A shock of searing cold ran up Luka's arms. He gave one last desperate tug. The chair tipped backwards in a single frozen mass. Luka tried to stop the momentum, but it was too late. He watched the icy form of his father slam into the hard ground, shattering into 1,000 pieces that crowded around his feet. Dad, I don't understand. What does all this mean? The gentle rustle of leaves was the only reply. Luka's eyes struggled to focus on the walkie-talkie. Faintly, he could hear Rollo amongst the noise. Rollo's voice was coming through more clearly now. But some words were still just static. The signal went silent. Luka held still, waiting for a response, his pounding heartbeat marking the passage of time. Lolo's voice began to fade. With that, the signal died for good. Luka grabbed the walkie-talkie and sprinted to the treehouse. Luka heard a group of footsteps. He dashed behind the bushes to avoid being spotted. Mr. Tolliver paused, shifting his eyes to one side. Mr. Tolliver took one long, quiet breath. The three shared a determined look. see a cloaked shape behind the rocket. He strained to hear as a muffled voice fear gripped Luka's throat. Luka stared at the ground for a moment, trying to place the dampened voice. The figure shifted slowly from behind the rocket, revealing itself to Luka. Luka reached over empathetically. Iggy's tone jolted to dejected ache. Luka slumped to the ground, overwhelmed by guilt. Iggy slumped to his knees. Luka grabbed the walkie-talkie and headed for the window. Luka and Iggy climbed up the back of the treehouse to its roof, where Rollo had constructed his MCDC, the Mission Control Defense Cannon. From behind the crowd of clipboards, William Kerr strode forward. A warm Kerr's smile faltered. Luka's grip tightened on the MCD. Luka's mind raced. He was caught in a trap. What do you do when there's no hope? Iggy wiped his cheeks with a sleeve. What are you gonna do, Luka? Luka drew himself up and decided to take the only option they had left. Fight. He swung the mission control defense cannon around, aiming it confidently at the smirking face of William Kerr. Luka summoned his most insolent. Kerr turned his back on the two boys. With a nonchalant wave of the hand, he made his exit. As the clipboards began to slowly advance on the treehouse, Luka looked to Iggy with resignation in his eyes. The end. That escalated quickly. Maybe discretion was the better part of valor here. Let's put a pin in this for now. This is a story about struggle. Luka could hear a machine humming somewhere nearby. He felt around wildly, searching for something, and his hands found a hard object, maybe a tile. He yanked it free, lifting the cold stone. Let me! Luka swung the tile as hard as he could at the shape that still held fast to his leg. He heard the crack of glass as the stone hit the assailant's mask. With a muffled yelp, the hand let go. Luka was free and scrambled to the door. He never looked back once on the long run home. Chapter 3. Everything's fine. The next morning, it was quieter than usual at the breakfast table. Only the sound of silverware and chewing interrupted the awkward silence. Settled at his counter, Hiram Tolliver was meticulously shining apples. More accurately, Hiram Tolliver was With a yelp, Mr. Tolliver fumbled the apple, flailing at the air. He leaned forward. He leaned in a bit further. Mr. Tolliver leaned back, speaking loud enough for anyone to hear. He reached forward and snapped up the jars of jam, giving Luka a little wink. He leaned in for a final. She leaned forward and pinched Luka's cheek. Luka shifted the basket uncomfortably. Mrs. Fratelli lifted the cloth and inspected the jam. She carefully lifted out her jars of jam. Mr. Nuncreed eyed Luka for a moment. Nuncreed snatched the basket from Luka. Beck locked eyes with Luka. The look on her face was equal parts expectant and desperate. Beck gave Luka a quick nudge. took a long breath, then gave a firm nod. Chapter Dinner with the Moodwill. Ilona Moodwill was worried about change. A gardener at heart, she understood the necessity of change, relied on it even. But there was a difference between the controlled world of her plants and this cluttered cottage in a strange town. Almost done. Nellie was a blur of activity, digging through boxes. Sorry, love, couldn't find the dishes. Dinner went by without much conversation. As she watched Beck and Luka finish up their pizza, Ilona let herself relax into the chair. The things she cared about were still here. Nellie finally had the job of her dreams. Beck was beginning to take root. Ilona's task was simply to tend. She could do that. Luka's eyes were fixed to his plate, pushing a chunk of pineapple around with his finger. Nellie was the one who eventually broke the silence. Ilona nervously gestured toward the... Luka wiped his face with his sleeve. Beck gave Luka a swift kick under the table. Luka glanced over to Beck. Beck slammed her fist into the table, perhaps harder than she intended. Luka glanced outside to gauge the time. The sky was darker than he expected, filled with ominous clouds. Luka wiped his mouth one last time with his napkin and started to get up. Surprised, Luka turned around. He knew Rollo could be prickly around new people. But Beck seemed cool. Rollo would warm up to her eventually. Probably. Luka began to respond, but the sky answered for him. Luka surveyed the roiling clouds. At that moment, the heavens opened up, Luka bent down to examine the bouquet of wilting flowers. Judging by the odor, they were... He flipped open the attached card. flicked at one of the toggles. Luka squinted into the eye hole. Luka adjusted the slide with his fingers to get a better look. Luka wiped his hand off on his sweater and gave a nervous laugh. Beck looked down, timidly tapping the ladder with her feet. Beck took a moment to watch. Luka took a deep breath, exhaling. Luka let out a feral scream. Her voice dropped to a tremble. Beck brushed off her shirt and straightened up. As abruptly as it began, the storm abated. Beck gave Luka a light thump on the arm before heading. Chapter 5. Friendly Feud. The air was heavy with the hard rain's residue, the smell of wet things. Despite his dreary surroundings, Luka felt at peace. He'd never shared those details about his dad with anyone, not even Rollo. But it's not like this changed anything. Rollo was still his best friend. Adding Beck to the group would help balance things out. Everything's better in threes. This is what Luka told himself as he headed. Luka had only ever heard him speak in this stiff yet gentle tone, and it always meant one thing. Rollo scoffed. Luka stumbled on his words, knowing he'd... Luka became instinctively. Both boys were now shouting across the distance. Rollo's tone changed to a calm, yet more The words hung in the cold night air. Rollo's stomach dropped, knowing he'd crossed a line. But it was too late. Luka dug through his old stuff, not even... Gran cooed gently from the hallway. Luka just wanted to be alone. He waited to hear the sound of the front door closing. Luka dozed off again. Luka still couldn't bring himself to go out. Besides, if he ran into Rollo, he'd have to actually confront the situation. The Adventures of Hank Atomic. Luka carefully opened the cover, and Rollo had received it for his birthday, a special hardcover edition with behind-the-scenes commentary, and Rollo cherished it, but asked that Luka keep it. Luka wasn't sure if it was because Rollo didn't trust himself with it, didn't trust his sister around it, or just wanted an excuse to come hang out at Luka's more often. Whatever the reason, Luka didn't mind, but it had stayed right there where Rollo had stashed it ever since. Now, at the foot of his bed, Luka lost himself. He'd read it all before, But at this moment, he was well into issue number 5 when he heard soft footsteps from Without realizing it, Luka had pouted away the entire. He once again felt the weight of it all and allowed his weary eyes to close. Luka stood in a He looked up at his father standing beside him. Walt was working a straw at the bottom of a fountain glass, trying to collect the last bits of milkshake. Dad, taking a final loud gurgling sip. His father peered up from the glass. He jangled the straw playfully with a warm smile, then lifted the empty glass as if to point into the darkness. The source? Luka's eyes followed his father's gesture. In an instant, he was sitting in front of a blazing campfire. Across from him sat a large figure in a yellow. The figure's voice was a scratchy echo. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour, make yourself comfortable. Luka held his shivering hands over the flame to warm himself. It doesn't work that way here. Their yellow-gloved hand pointed to the base of the flame. It's a cold flame. See? Luka peered at the base of the fire. It wasn't wood that was burning. Tiny buildings, freezing and crumbling as they were consumed. Luka could see small shadows moving in the burning people. Luka leapt to his feet. We've got to help them! The figure gave a dismissive wave of their hand. Why waste energy helping people who can't even help themselves? The figure bent down to examine the panicked crowd as they desperately tried to stop the flames. They only care about what's right in front of them, not like us. Luka's voice was a trembling whisper. Us? The figure slowly stood up, grabbing its helmet with both hands. With a jolt and a twist, the suit emitted a gasp. A cloud of torpid mist escaped, slowly revealing the face within. Luka's own face looked back at him, older, worn, distant. The sensation was oddly familiar, as if he'd caught his own reflection by surprise in the mirror. The doppelganger smiled. I tried to help once. He gestured towards his face. And all it got me was this. Luka staggered back. You aren't me. Luka felt a hand catch his shoulder. His father was there again, beside him. Every choice sets us on a path. This is the end of one of your paths, son. Luka watched his older self shake its head ruefully, its face twisting into a cruel grin. Well, Dad, if you wanted him to see this, far be it from me to disappoint. Luka watched in shock as the figure took a confident step forward and plunged into the flames in a flash of cold light. What does all of this mean? Luka felt a reassuring squeeze on his shoulder. Just remember, why we choose matters just as much as what we choose. Luka woke up to see a hazy figure at the foot of his bed, silhouetted in the morning sun. Luka rubbed his eyes. The kind, concerned face of his gran came into focus. Gran silenced Luka with a gentle pat on the leg. Luka gave a reluctant nod. Luka took a deep breath. Chapter 6. Through thick and thin. Despite Luka's bitterness, Gran was right. he needed. A big fight changes the nature of a friendship. Whether, in the end, it is for the better or for the worse, all comes down to understanding. If one is not careful, the same familiarity that builds the strongest of bonds can become the wrecking ball that shatters them. Luka emerged from seclusion, taking in the crisp festival air. But the events of the day weren't on his mind. He had to find Rollo. Roxy rolled her eyes, shaking her head. Luka looked down and kicked at the dirt. Kato's eyes lit with excitement. Kato straightened up and cleared his throat. Kato stared at Luka. Luka grabbed The Adventures of Hank Atomic, issue number 4. Luka grabbed The Adventures of Hank Atomic, issue number 5 from the Kato removed his book from the desk and replaced it with Luka's, turning on the lamp. As he slid the book under the purple light, 2 words glowed. The Adventures of Hank Atomic, issue 5. Luka clicked his tongue with recognition. Kato began flipping through the pages, stopping when he hit a glowing word. He continued flipping. Reaching the end of the book, Kato looked up. Before Luka could finish his sentence, Griffin handed... Luka shrugged. taking a sizable bite out of the corn. Luka tongued at his cheeks, feeling something rough. He reached into his mouth and pulled out a slip of paper. He shook off the bits of corn dog to read the slip. Luka finished off the remainder of the corn dog. Lumi waved his hands around sarcastically as he began. Rollo sheepishly handed Luka the... Luka threw himself at Rollo. Rollo handed Luka an unopened letter. Luka, some things are going to happen that might be difficult for you to understand. If I am honest, I hardly understand them myself. But whatever happens, I need you to know that I love you. None of this is fair to you. You have already lost so much. We both have. I wish there was a simpler way forward. But if there is, I haven't thought of it. God knows I've tried. Everything I've done, I did for you. I hope someday you can accept that. Love, Gran. Luka folded the paper into his pocket and headed up the ladder. Luka was at a loss for words, but that was fine. Words aren't always necessary. Sadly, this was untrue. A distant rumble shook the tree. It was not fireworks. It was something the boys could... Something as old and cruel. A shockwave of cold tore through the room. A bitter... Before they could react, it encased the two boys. reunited by friendship, only to be cruelly separated, and so our story ends on this melancholy scene, in a silent treehouse turned statuary, in a town brought low by its for the rest of time. The end. No, that can't be the ending. It simply can't. I won't accept it, and I hope there are more endings, more possibilities. We are just going to have to sort through them all until we find the one that fits. Luka began to respond, but the sky answered for him as the clouds above began to break, revealing patches of star-filled summer night. Moonlight filtered down, shimmering in the treetops. Luka drew himself up and decided to take the only option that he squinted down the barrel of the mission control defense cannon, aiming it through. He looked up with surprise as it struck true. Luka and Iggy winced as they sprinted through the thicket. The branches clawed at them, reluctant to give path. After what felt like a marathon, that was all he was able to say. The boys tumbled down a steep decline. In fact, it was chapter signs. They stood silently, catching their breath. The sky was like, with each breath, a plume of... Let's keep moving. Luka pulled Iggy to his feet as they gave... The boys stared in disbelief at the sign that now clearly read, Luka had almost forgotten the walkie-talkie. Luka looked at Iggy with a resigned sigh. Luka winced. The crunching of footsteps trailing Luka went hush. He looked back to see Iggy's face. Luka peered upward at the darkening sky. He let out a long, faintly. Seeing Iggy in such a pathetic state gave Luka a sense of compassion, and Luka allowed himself to collapse next. The boys huddled together for warmth and comfort, if not for exhaustion. As it was, all they had. Iggy motioned sarcastically to his half-deformed face. Iggy shrugged. Iggy now wept open. He wiped his nose with a sleeve. Luka gave a warm chuckle. Iggy cleared his throat as he wiped his eye. Iggy arched into a wide yawn. Luka's eyelids began to slowly drift shut. That's all Luka could whisper before succumbing to sleep. Iggy snuggled in some more. The house smelled of warm bread. Luka was playing with toy blocks. He looked up to see his parents on the... His mother held his father's head. A voice behind Luka spoke. Luka turned to see the doppelganger from his dream. Aww. Look, the figure picked up a toy block. It's amazing the facades. Not that I blame you. Don't remember, do you? Luka snatched the block from the figure's yellow glove. The doppelganger pointed to the couch. The last day we saw him, the day he chose to... Luka turned to look at his father, still lounging. That's not true. He didn't know. The doppelganger waved his hand dismissively. Everything is true here. It's just... Let me show you. The world flickered in pulse. Luka was sitting next to his bed. The doppelganger limped into the room. Now. He grabbed Luka's hand and guided the stethoscope to... Luka heard muffled shouting. It was his parents. Do you remember what we did next? Luka gave a slow nod and crept down. He could see the outline of his mother at the bottom of the stairs. Damn it, Walt. We can't afford to get involved. She was scared. His father stepped forward. What am I supposed to do? Just watch? There's a sickness in this town, and we both know whose... I swore an oath to help people. I won't turn my back on them. Luka's mother grabbed Walt. She was crying, pleading. I can't... Walt calmly removed Eleanor's hand from his shoulder. What's right is right, and what's wrong is wrong. I could never live with myself if I let Sharper get away with this. Eleanor raised her voice. Spare me your bullshit platitudes. What about our son? Luka flinched, dropping the stethoscope down the stairs. Walt turned with a panicked smile. Luka? Is that you, buddy? With tears in his eyes, Luka descended the stairs. Mom? Dad? What's going on? Walt dropped to a knee to meet Luka. Eyes. Nothing, buckaroo. Your mom and I just got a little overexcited is all. Luka placed the stethoscope against his father's chest. His heart was racing. It sounded like you were
going somewhere?
Walt gently removed the device from Luka's ears. Listen to me, Luka. I have some business to take care of. I'll be back in time to tuck you in. Luka hugged his father tightly. Promise? Walt stood up and walked to the door. He glanced over his shoulder. I promise. With a wink and a grin, he put on his hat and strode out into the evening sun. A figure approached soundlessly from the foggy snowfall. It stood above them, lingering, slowly raising one hand above Iggy. It snapped out two brisk From a deep slumber, Iggy sprang up. Whether it was the calming presence or the recognition that he was not in danger, Iggy felt his clenched fists lower. Luka looked up, gradually remembering his whereabouts. The figure exhaled a cloud of warm vapor. When it came to complete strangers, Iggy had trouble cobbling together an instant. Iggy huffed with gratification. Nat began to turn away indifferently. Iggy turned sharply and began to stomp off. Realizing he'd worn their patience then, Luka and Iggy turned around with hope in their eyes. Nat took a deep breath in. Nat exhaled slowly, then snapped. For a brief moment, Luka and Iggy let themselves believe that some great magic was about to unfold until they opened their eyes and found themselves in the exact same place, cold and disheartened. Nat narrowed his eyes, furrowed his brow, and uttered. Luka began to laugh uncomfortably. He looked down and his eyes started back and forth in contemplation. With a sudden pain, a thought He sprinted off into the pale distance. As Iggy turned to follow, Nat called out. Chapter 6. The Source. Nat expressed his sympathy with a shrug and sauntered off as unassumingly as he'd arrived. He'd given Luka and Iggy what they needed, and as Luka sprinted across the snow, the events of the past few days became clearer. Rollo said he was underground somewhere, captured. Mr. Kerr tried to cover it up with lies. The clipboards were hell-bent on capturing Iggy. It all seemed to point to perennial harvest, but right now, there was one thing that Luka needed to know. Luka stopped dead in his tracks. The tree was gone. Uprooted and moved, he dropped to his knees and dug wildly at the cold snow. His numb hands hit something hard. A dry whisper escaped Luka's lips. There was no reply, just snow-covered silence. Iggy finally noticed the tears welling in Luka's eyes and the snow-covered grave. Suddenly, they heard the crunch of approaching footsteps in the snow. He bent down to scoop up a snowball and lobbed it playfully. Luka stuttered through heaving sobs. Iggy gave Luka a solid smack on the back of his head. Luka wiped his eyes with a Iggy flashed a mischievous Iggy and Luka shared a Iggy darted behind a large pine. He emerged, holding a shoebox. Luka rolled his. Iggy stifled. Iggy triumphantly raised. Looking down at the frozen. Luka and Iggy inched up. Arctic air breathed out of the cavern and heat. Mr. Kerr gazed down the abyss in contemplation. Kerr scratched the back of his head. His face contorted into a saccharine grin. Kerr snapped his fingers. Iggy turned to Luka with a sly. Iggy waved the box into the air. Iggy plucked a single bottle rocket from the box. After a long pause, Mr. Kerr flung up. Mr. Kerr sighed into the fridge. With a nonchalant flick, Iggy tossed the firework into the hole. With a growl, Kerr leapt at Iggy. Iggy tried to twist away, but in the struggle they both tumbled. Luka dove forward, bracing Iggy's hand just before. His grip was made precarious. He could see Kerr further down. Mr. Kerr gasped with a wild look in his eye. Mr. Kerr. Luka's hand began to cramp. Luka felt Iggy loose. Every muscle in Luka's body. Luka felt his hand slipping. A calm settled over. Iggy's voice was colder than the bitter air billowing from Luka had no choice but to refuse Iggy's request. He tightened his grip and reached. A wild delight crept onto Miss. That's a good lad. Iggy begged Luka with his eyes. We need help. It wasn't long before they were once again surrounded by clipboard. Mr. Kerr sighed with relief from mirror. Now. A clipboard dutifully produced an ornate ivory hand mirror, and Mr. Kerr began preening his tusk. Ah, that's better. Mr. Van Horn, I'll put in a good word for you with the founder. Take them away. A swarm of hands overpowered Luka. The last thing he saw, the end. I think this was one of those times where doing the right. Luka began to respond, but the sky answered for him as the clouds above began to break, revealing patches of star-filled summer night. moonlight filtered down, shimmering. Luka stopped himself mid-sentence. Luka saw Beck skulking by the gate. Beck grabbed the wrought iron bars and shook. Beck's voice was an excited whisper. The mysterious figure retracted their mask, hair pushing out from all corners. A chill ran down Luka's spine, his vision blurred. Beck stifled a sharp wince, and Luka looked down to see himself run. Gran tousled her hair back under the face. Gran gave Eris a curt nod and disappeared. Chapter 5. What big ears you have. Luka sat, shivering, after checking to make sure the coast was clear. The clipboard finished writing. Mr. Nuncreed, arms. He snatched the pad and scribbled his name. The clipboards looked at each other for a moment, then broke into laughter as they walked. Whenever Luka saw his dad's chair by it reminded him of the days they'd passed. Luka opened the tackle box and picked the Luka gently baited a feather onto the hook, good for skimming the surface. Luka gently baited a feather onto the hook, good for skimming the surface. Luka tied a shoestring. What fish could resist a nice Luka tied a small magnet to the line, fishing with the law of attraction. Luka stuck a toy stretchy hand onto the hook. Those things always get dirty anyway. Luka wrapped some tape around the... Hey, you never know. Luka placed a sinker on the line. Sometimes the best stuff is at the bottom of the pond. Luka wrapped a twig of thyme. Some fish have refined taste. Luka tied a bent nail onto the— If all you have is a hammer— Rollo waggled his head with— Rolo and Luka shot back a Luka gazed out the window. Chapter 6. Secret Lair. Summer forged ahead, but the nights only seemed to grow colder. Luka walked home slowly under the pale starlight, cautious to avoid any more surprises lurking in the shadows. Reaching home, he slipped quietly into bed, half dreading what they might discover the next day. Luka and Beck rolled their eyes as Rolo strutted across the room. Rolo flung open the cabinet with confidence. He coughed as a veil of dust. A look of realization crept onto Luke. All three kids snapped to glance at each other, then sprinted in turn toward the kitchen. Before he could finish, Luka scrambled up Rolo's back. The three crowded around the hutch to peer in. With the glass doors opened, a perfect porcelain display gleamed in front. Their eyes searched for anything amiss, but the only distinct feature was its impeccability. As Beck pulled on one of the teacups, it slanted forward with a hollow click. The entire hutch began to rustle and slide under its own power. A spider web of string connected photos of people from the town, interspersed with hastily scrawled notes. Rollo casually spun open. He smacked his lip. Rollo plunged his hand in the jar, fishing out a soggy slip of paper. Rollo offered the slimy note to Luka and licked his fingers clean. Luka jostled each cabinet drawer in turn. Only one was unlocked. He fingered through the filing cabinet, pausing at a bulging folder labeled Walter. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Luka nodded and caressed the label with his... Rollo swiped the folder from the drawer. He whistled to himself. He stopped at a page and mimed, holding up a monocle. Rollo looked up with heightened surprise. Rollo's finger traced across the page. Rollo scanned through several more pages. Luka, staring blankly at the cabinet this whole time. Rollo rustled the folder, trying to loose more pages. Luka frantically shoved the remaining cabinet folders, trying to find another labeled Walter. Luka slammed the drawer shut. They crowded around a worn-down old map of Beacon Pines. Rollo carefully traced the path with his finger. He jabbed down at the end point. Luka looked up. flicked off the light, and they became overhead, creaking floorboards. The kids looked up, the tilt of their necks following each footfall. Then suddenly, without realizing, they'd been holding their breath. All three exhaled shakily and glanced at each other. A muffled male voice broke the silence. A final few footsteps reached the entrance above them, and the voice now echoed down the stairs. The three kids shuffled to the corners without a peep. As he began to descend the stairs, the man's voice punctuated every new step. Thump. 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 At the bottom step, the man paused, squinting to search the room for signs of life. Rollo shifted suddenly. Luka gave him an intense, chastising look and whispered through clenched teeth. It was too late. Rollo was already inching toward the stairway. He screeched as he charged toward the shadowy figure. With all his weight, Rollo tackled the man to the ground. From the dark corner, they saw something move. Luka scrambled to the hunched figure on the ground. Pressing his fingers to the man's neck, he sighed with relief. As Beck flicked back on the light, Luka and Rollo both gasped in stereo. Chapter 7. The Interrogation of Hiram Tolliver. Still unconscious, Mr. Tolliver slumped. His hands were bound with rope. The kids huddled in a circle, discussing their plan. One thing was certain. They couldn't just let Mr. They needed to know what he was doing. After some deliberation, Rollo brandished a steel. I've got this. Read about it 100 times. Rollo swaggered past the chair which propped up the slumping Hiram Tolliver. Without even looking at his captive, he began with a long, blustery drawl. Mr. Tolliver remained motionless. Rollo spun around to face him. He'd clearly expected to rouse Mr. Tolliver with his booming voice. Beck and Luka gave each other an unsure glance. Rollo slammed his fist on the table. He grabbed the table lamp and beamed it onto the unconscious face. Mr. Tolliver groaned and slowly lifted his head. He recoiled with a muddled, weary squint. The chair wobbled as he attempted to straighten up. Mr. Tolliver could only make out rough shapes through the glaring light. With a gruff tone, Rollo hoped to both conceal his voice and intimidate. The doubtful expression on Beck and Luka's faces transformed into awe. Rollo, hitting his stride, was now channeling every detective trope his memory could recall. He slammed the table again. Mr. Tolliver's voice became desperate. He was nearly in tears. Mr. Tolliver was in a daze, now more confused than ever. He shook his head, feeling more and more dizzy. His voice faded to a whisper. With that, Mr. Tolliver passed out cold. Rollo swung around with a Chapter 8. 6 feet under, 3 towns. The kids spent the rest of the afternoon combing through dusty piles of old county records, desperately searching for anything that could help them make sense. Luka tried to shake the thought of Gran's basement, but his focus wavered. Explosives. Messages hidden in jam. Gran was the only family he had left. He still couldn't bring himself to believe the word. But the old map with the symbol of explosives in. As the sun began to set, the kids were no closer to the Rollo shut his book within a certain. Rollo muttered under his breath. Beck slammed her finger down on the open page before glancing down to read. Something tickled the back of Luka's mind. The question hung in the air. Beck rubbed her eye. Luka's heart was pounding if he was lucky. Gran. And of course, there was Mr. Tom. Dealing with him would be the first. Luka shook out his arms to. He held her. She was asleep. His only hope was that she hadn't. Mr. Tolliver was nowhere to be. Or maybe Gran knew everything. Luka's hungry stomach groaned. Not realizing it, he'd gone the entire day without eating. Luka rushed over to the pile of jam jars, unscrewed one, and shoveled a handful into his mouth. He flipped the lid to read the label. As Luka climbed the final stair, the emotion of the day dragged heavily. With each consecutive step, his legs weakened. His stride began to falter. He tried to grab for the railing to steady himself. Something was wrong. Luka groaned, and his limbs might as well have been bolted to the. Through numb lips, he mumbled just before falling asleep. Chapter 9. A speech to end all speeches. Luka awoke to find himself face down in bed. He moaned into his pillow. Why was she trying to drug Mr. Nuncreed? Shaking the questions from his woozy head, Luka snapped back to the matter at hand. Augustus Valentine nervously Gus cleared his throat and awkwardly loosened his tie. William Kerr bounded on the stage with the energy of a preacher at a big tent revival. He gave Gus a hearty slap on the back and motioned him off the stage. Mr. Kerr pulled a thick stack of note cards out from his vest. Mr. Kerr took a moment to survey the crowd. He wiped away a He thumped the podium to emphasize each. Mr. Kerr nodded confidently, biting his lip. The crowd was silent, in rapt attention. Mr. Kerr methodically made eye contact with each section of the His voice began to build to a crescendo. The crowd began to look around nervously. Mr. Kerr quickly flicked through his note cards. He raised his hands up to the heavens. At that moment, a merciless wall of impossibly cold air ripped through the crowd, instantly freezing everyone and everything it touched. For a man like William Kerr, this was a fitting way for things to end. On a stage, with an entire town frozen. The end. There's that ice again! Maybe we should just quit? Maybe you should. No, I don't mean that. We got a little closer this time. We just need to try again. Please. They'd run the classic. Luka and Rollo ducked behind a barrel, leaving Beck to her task. With a few crisp snaps, she roused Mr. Tolliver. Mr. Tolliver looked down and shifted. Beck caught herself before letting the surprise manifest on. She'd already gotten him to reveal this was going to be easy. Mr. Tolliver wriggled a bit in his restraints. Beck quickly removed the ropes. Mr. Tolliver rubbed the growing knot on his forehead. Beck twirled her hand, as if to prompt Mr. Tolliver to finish her thought. Beck shook her head and clicked her tongue. Mr. Tolliver let out an amused huff in agreement. Beck was on a roll now, playing Mr. Tolliver like a fiddle. Heading for the stairs, Mr. Tolliver hesitated and turned to Beck with a puzzled look. She grinned and gave him a peppy wave. With a shrug, he continued up the stairs, whistling a jaunty tune. Beck blinked slowly in disappointment. She turned to the table and began tearing small scraps of paper. Beck marked each scrap of paper and leaned back. Luka and Beck looked at Rollo with amazement. Gus looked around nervously. Eris's cry hung in the air. Solomon stood proudly at the entrance to the drugstore, holding a brown bag overflowing with black licorice. Solomon shoveled a surprising amount of licorice into his mouth. Beck cupped her hands on the glass to peek inside. Beck flung open the door, and they all squeezed in. Luka cracked his knuckles and entered the letters into the keypad. The inside of the phone booth dropped loose from its shell. Without even the space to panic, they closed their eyes, held their breath. Suddenly, the chaotic descent slowed to an effortless landing. It was unclear where they ended up, but at least it was solid ground. The air was stagnant and smelled vaguely of chlorine. Rollo's hands hovered over the field of blinking buttons. Joseph waited for a moment in silence. He gestured toward the strange tubes. Nuncreed let out a growl of a sigh. He shook his head wistfully. Nuncreed took a menacing step towards the children. Luka began to laugh. The color drained from Nuncreed's face. Nuncreed grabbed Luka by the shoulders. His eyes were frantic. A jolt of realization struck Mr. Nuncreed. Chapter 8. The Cold, Hard Truth. Beck leapt up, allowing the suction to yank her into the dark. Dimness eclipsed around her. Her only points of reference were glints of upcoming. She heard the tinny, distant. Once she stopped. Then, all of a sudden, as if minutes had passed a burst of wintry air snuffed across her face, and she was As they rounded the corner to the frozen town square, they spotted Mr. Nuncreed inching. He held his arms out gingerly, as if... Upon closing the distance, Luka recognized. Gran stood confidently at the edge, one arm outstretched over the abyss. Nearby, a wheelbarrow had been emptied out. She held a lit torch. Mr. Nuncreed turned back toward the kids. Desperate. Rollo and Beck held steadfast in awe. Luka approached closer. Mr. Nuncreed spun back toward Gran. His voice... Mr. Nuncreed winced with anguish. His voice hardened. They both now yelled, not to each other, but at fate itself, making their peace with long-held burdens. The wind howled with encouragement. They menaced at each other, both catching their breath. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Amid a blur of emotions and memories, Luka's mind, the wind calmed. And in the stillness, after the death of his father, Luka had each night, his mother would sit at the foot of his bed. It was the only thing that could calm his mind. The only thing that, however briefly, could make it all seem okay. That melody pervaded every memory Luka had of his mother. Shivering in the raw snow, he began to hum it out loud. Gran lowered the torch, listening close as recognition slowly set in. Her heart sank. Those countless nights of consolation, the incomparable loss they shared together. She let the torch fall to the snow and a few steps toward Luka was all she could bear before dropping to the snow herself. Through a flood of tears, she Luka lifted his head in astonishment. The last time he heard that melody was the last night he saw his mother. Luka blinked through blurry, watery eyes, trying to see more clearly. He could just make out the impression of a familiar face. He peered across the snowscape at the woman on her knees. Something about her was undeniably his mother, only smaller, older, changed. Luka sprinted as fast as he could toward his mother. They held each other close, and the Eleanor looked down at Luka, tightening her embrace in an appeal for forgiveness. Joseph slumped into the cold, wet snow. For the first time in a long time, her voice felt like her own again. Luka gazed down at Nuncrete with pity. Joseph stared into the snow as if searching it for answers. Chapter 9. The Devil You Know. 7 months ago, Eleanor Van Horn crept down the maze of... She stopped in front of the large steel door marked Deep Engineering. No turning back now. She raised a trembling hand. The stolen keycard worked as promised, and the door buzzed open with mechanical efficiency. She was immediately hit with the smell of... It was some sort of laboratory. In one corner was a desk covered in papers. She rushed to the desk and began shifting through the piles of papers. They were experiment reports on something called... There were dozens of them. Every one stamped failed. Eleanor heard the sharp echo of footsteps approaching. She was out of time. Her eyes scanned the room, eventually landing on the strange pile. Muttering a curse under her breath, she dashed over and dove inside. Mr. Kerr addressed the crowd with a sarcastic tone. Whispers filtered through the crowd. Torment dragged on Joseph Nuncrete's face. He paused for a moment, plucking a piece of fuzz from his sweater and discarding it to the ground. Kerr gave a bow of deference. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Solomon pulled a glass vial from his pocket. In one smooth motion, he downed its content. A triumphant smile grew across Solomon's lips. His body and face began to contort and expand as he... A hushed horror gripped the crowd. This is a... Sharper examined his new hands. Sharper choked out a crude squawk of a laugh. Frustrated grumbles sprinkled through the crowd. William Kerr gave a subtle nod to the clipboards. A helpless quiet settled over the crowd. Sharper addressed the crowd with indignant pride. He'd planned this moment for so long that now, at the deed's fruition, it almost felt frivolous. Mr. Kerr flourished a preposterously elaborate Sharper coughed up one final laugh and cracked his knuckles. And so, Sharper set about remaking the town in his own. The fertilizer factory soon reopened for business. Sales rose steadily as more and more farmers across the countryside began to swear by its miraculous properties. Beacon Pines became famous, a secretive town that, for the right price, shared its gifts with all. Gifts that became more and more necessary in a world. The end. This is wrong, but things are becoming clearer now. You can feel it, right? We can't let Sharper win. Let's see. Well, time to bust out the tickles. Beck lunged forward and began to tickle under. Tears began to form in Tish's eyes as she gasped for breath between gales of laughter. Beck redoubled her efforts until Tish finally had had enough. Iggy's eyes darted around. Iggy kicked at the puddle. Beck shook the ooze out of her hair as best as she could. Chapter 4. The best policy. Luka paused for a moment. He'd only just met Beck. Hopefully he could make it up to her. But Roxy and Fitz looked drained. It was clear they'd spent all day searching. Roxy's temper could often be dismissed as the impatience of an older sibling, but this was the most intense Luka had ever. Her eyes were wild and unfocused. In a torrent of rambled words and Roxy, still exhausted and angry, softened briefly as her eyes hunted the ground in thought. With a determined sigh, she looked up at Luka. Roxy drew her... Roxy tried to think of the safest place to send Luka. Luka wiped his cheeks and gave a quick... Looking into the puddle, Mr. Nuncreed jumped with a... Luka motioned to the phone booth. Mr. Nuncreed gently placed one of his... Luka peered up at Mr. Nuncreed. There was a deeper emotion. It was subtle, but Luka could sense... Like a trap ready to spring. Luka felt the weight of Nuncreed's hand on his shoulder. Something wasn't. He didn't know why, but... Luka twisted free of Nuncreed's grasp. He aired a long holler into the woods. Luka felt his eyes getting heavy and plopped. He conceded to its lumpy embrace. Once again, this time, he took a single confidence. The world flickered and pulsed. He found himself standing in front of the source. He plopped down cross-legged. Soon enough, the fire began. Luka stood up and dust. He plucked the glowing ember from a keepsake. The voice of his father's. You made me proud, Buckaroo. Luka turned to face him. Dad, what is a warm grin? A place where everything... Luka found himself staring at his father's face. Wait. Another voice spoke out. As that's up to you, without knowing why. Is any of this... Luka's father bent down. Of course. I'm as real as the part of you that misses. Luka turned to look at the older version of himself. And you? The doppelganger choked back tears. I'm as real as the part of you that's angry he's gone. Through his tears, Luka laughed. His father pulled him in for an embrace. Time to go, Buckaroo. Luka was startled from his dream by a banging on the... A commanding voice rumbled. Just as Luka sprang to lock the entry hatch, the door knocked open. Chapter 5. Dangers big and... Luka stumbled back, keeping his eyes fixed on the hatch. As his hand grasped the door, a large figure... The large figure cocked its head inquisitively. Luka's jaw. He peered more closely at the man standing in front of him. Something about him was only bigger, changed. Rollo proudly presented his hands to Luka. Luka moved to the side and pointed Rollo to his reflection in the balcony window. His hands shot up to his face. Rollo shadowboxed. With a yelp, Rollo She shot a nervous glance at Rollo. Vex's eyes narrowed. Ilona tried to put on a smile. She sighed, and after a moment, looked down at Beck sympathetically. She flashed a sly grin and tousled Beck's hair. Luka gave Rollo a quick elbow to the ribs. Beck flicked a large sheet. Rollo started to wiggle with excitement. Chapter: The Heist. They spent the night's end huddled. It would be no small feat. A modern, not to mention the swarm of. By the time the sun began to peek through the car window used as this could just. The final day before they'd need to pool every resource at their, even enlist some unsavory character. Luckily, there was enough ill will and Luka, Beck, and Rollo. They hadn't slept. The festival was to begin. He waved vaguely at Rollo's sizable figure. Beck snorted an involuntary. They each looked at each other with sleepy confidence and nodded. Jeff's hardware closed down about a year ago. The effects of the foul harvest stretched wide when there are no crops in the field. Jeff wheezed out. The joy in Jeff's face drained instantly. Looking into the sullen eyes of his wood. Jeff's brow perked up. Sensing some traction, Luka carried on. Jeff's scowl faded. One good Luka offered out his open hand with a firm and dusty. Iggy raised an eyebrow. Iggy gave a reluctant Iggy considered the point. A wild-eyed grin. Iggy glanced over to Tish. With a quick nod, Luka was off. Iggy gazed up at Tish with a smile. A single tear ran down Tish's cheek. Chapters into the hive. A good heist requires preparation, and thorough preparation takes time. So far, everything was in order. Jeff, Iggy, and Beck radioed Luka that night with a simple and covert message. And Rollo, after a lengthy confession, managed to persuade Roxy and Fitz to help. He stowed away in mission control for the night. Rollo, being the outfit provided by Rollo took a few He had to think quick. Rollo sighed, adjusting his With a stroke of his mustache, Rollo proceeded into the Perennial Harvest headquarters. He stammered and flipped through the pages. Rollo interrupted with urgency in his voice. Rollo panicked. The distraction was enough for Rollo. The clipboard fumbled around in a frenzy. Solomon stopped in his track. A veneer of confusion flashed across Solomon's face. His words rushed out. Solomon's facade briefly faltered. Luka happened to notice a plaque above the door. Luka tried the handle. Solomon leaned forward to examine the Luka smiled and looked at his watch. She mimed a quick hat tip and ambled off with... The light on the keypad changed from red to green. Luka switched on his walkie-talkie. On the computer screen, a green cursor blinked and Luka pecked out his best guess. The screen blinked. Solomon's jaw clenched into a half smile. Luka quickly scanned the columns for number 247. Once again, Luka scrutinized the numbers on the... In that moment of distraction, Solomon reached forward and pressed... He quickly skimmed the screen with his finger. Mr. Kerr approached with a sneer and spoke into his walkie-talkie. With self-satisfaction, he called into the hallway. Nellie leaned over to examine his... Nellie sighed. Solomon muttered inaudibly. Solomon once again muttered under his breath. Luka held his hand up to the ashtray. With a subtle Luka tugged on each of them. They heard the trampling of friends. Her eyes searched the floor in thought. Solomon watched eagerly, waiting for with a sickened look. She peered. Solomon clapped with genuine delight. Solomon glanced Kerr presented it with a Before he could finish, Rollo snatched the vial from Kerr's palm. Rollo casually tossed the vial to Luka. Luka jiggled the vial mockingly. She held it tightly behind her back. Solomon sighed, speaking in crisp, measured syllables. He pursed his lips. A deep uncertainty washed over Beck. She looked to Nellie shakily. With a dispirited nod, Nellie sighed in defeat. Beck slowly approached. With apprehension, Beck conceded. Solomon pocketed the vial and brushed off his shoulder with a sharp flick. The blood drained from Kerr's face. Solomon shook his head with gratification. A muffled applause resonated faintly through the walls. The color dropped from Luka's face. Luka was over. A sudden explosion sounded. Chapter 8, Comeuppance. Ears still ring through the dust and smoke. She'd had to beg, borrow, and steal. How many nights had she spent visual? And now, her one shot traded for this jagged hole in a wall in a fool with Fratelli and Tolliver at her. It was a strange feeling. The last time she'd stalked this maze they quickly rounded a something worth guarding. She leapt forward, brand. If her last chance at vengeance for things lost was truly gone, she would just... They made their way out from deep within Perennial Harvest. Solomon pulled a glass vial from his pocket. In one smooth motion, he downed its contents. A triumphant smile grew across. With a mischievous look, Beck elbowed Luka. Remember when I had the vial behind my back? I might have tweaked his wonder potion with a little malice. His body and face began to contort and... The crowd gazed in stuns at the now empty stage. The quiet was broken when William Kerr sprinted off. He was never seen around Beacon. Watching the silhouette of Kerr first alone through his tears, he was... That was... perhaps a bit of an absurd ending for... I'm only writing the damn thing. Might have tweaked his wonder potion with a little change. His body and face began to contort and expand as he disappeared into a belching green mist. Eris awkwardly cradled the squirming child. She looked to her brother, her voice shaking with uncertainty. She looked back down at the infant with equal parts kindness and terror in her eyes. With a shake of her head, Eris addressed the crowd with a stern scowl. Epilogue. Beacon Pines' coldest summer on record came and went without much fanfare. Folks shared what they had and none were left wanting. The new school year was ushered in by the falling leaves of... After everything Luka, Rollo, and Beck had been through, the chill of winter didn't seem to bother people much. They kindled a hope for a better future. When spring arrived, farmers planted their crops with a sense of joy and optimism. And as the dawn of the first day of summer came again, its light slowly spread. It crept over his mind at peace, knowing he is here for a reason. I think this the end I've been waiting for. Honestly, I began to lose hope of ever finding it. But then you came along. I don't know exactly how to thank you. It's hard to explain how much this means to me. It's funny, now that our time together is finally ending. I'm at a loss for words. Let's just watch the end together.